Namaste. Professor Shyam, today's speaker, and other friends who have joined us today, Dr. Meera and other colleagues from the department and research scholars from the department. I welcome you all to this Friday webinar series. Today, in fact, it's a mix-up of Friday seminar series as well as academic support cell that we have began, which started this methodology lectures. So we are clubbing both of them so that we can derive maximum benefit out of this lecture. So that's how Professor Shyam is with us this evening. In fact, Nivedita would be introducing Professor Shyam formally, but I find like very distinguished scholar and also a translator of Patanjali Yoga Sūtra, which is published by Penguin, I believe, and a very interesting scholar with insights on Indian ethics. His book on Indian ethics, in fact, that can be taken as a textbook for undergraduates and postgraduates. That's why when I was reading it, I thought of I was prescribing it at various universities to be introduced to the students. So I'm just trying to stress the kind of importance that Professor Shyam has in this studies on classical Indian tradition. We are so happy to have him with us. Along with this, one important aspect which has, in fact, with which I I felt very close and invited him for this particular talk is his perspective on methodology. Okay. So when the question comes like, how do we understand a text from classical Indian tradition? How do we look at it? Is it, there are two perspectives that come out, one like insider's perspective and outsider's perspective. And even if you look at it from outsider's perspective in the sense that somebody who is from outside the tradition, how does one get into the text? Which now we stress that it has to be secular, it has to be like removed, bracketed from a lot of other things, etc. So in such kind of a situation, how do we look at classical Indian text? How do we interpret it? How do we get into the text, what it is trying to convey? These are very important questions. And one of the ways that we find, which is accepted well and which was advocated by at least Orthodox Indology, is a philological method. Get into the grammar of the text, and then that is how you can get into the intent of the text, and that's how you can interpret the text. So, but this though majorly this is accepted, there were certain limitations of this perspective because it will not get into the comprehensive account of what the text is basically trying to signify. So pointing out these limitations, there are various attempts by different scholars. In fact, we had one such kind of interpretation by Anand Vaidya a few months back, and we are going to have another different interpretation or different methodology of looking at a text by Professor Shyam Ranganathan. And when I heard him last time in this Mahabharata webinar series, I felt that he should be brought to the department as well, and department research scholars must get benefit of his new way of pointing out or positing this methodology. And that's so I have invited him, and he very kindly agreed to be with us. And in fact, he is telling us that it's 7 o'clock in the morning. In Delhi now, probably none of us would get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. And he got up and got ready for the talk, and he's kind enough to be with us this morning for morning at Canada. I really feel grateful that he for this kind gesture of academic solidarity. Thank you for being with us, Professor Shyam. Now I request Nivedita to formally introduce Professor Shyam.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bala, for the welcome address, and thank you so much for Professor Shyam for being with us today. So just to read out a few rules that we'll run the meeting by. We ask that everyone keep their mics muted and videos on during the presentation, if possible. During the Q&A, please keep your mics muted and use the Google Meet chat box function to please mention your questions. The moderator at their discretion will present your questions to the speaker thereby. In case we are unable to attend to your questions, please be prepared to ask your questions directly to the speaker by email after the session is over. In case of any queries, please feel to drop us a mail. And now I begin with an introduction of our esteemed scholar. We are privileged to have among us Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. He is at the Department of Philosophy and York Center for Asian Research, York University, Toronto. His area of academic specialization are Asian philosophy, especially South Asian or Indian philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of religion, philosophy of thought, political philosophy, philosophy of race, theoretical ethics, including normative ethics and meta-ethics, and South Asian religion. Dr. Ranganathan has many publications to his credit. He is the author of 2 books, namely Hinduism, a Contemporary Philosophical Investigation from New York Routledge in 2019, and Ethics and the History of Indian Philosophy from Delhi Motilal Banarsi Das. He is the editor of 2 volumes, including the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics. He is also the translator of Patanjali's Yoga Sūtra, which has been translated into English from Sanskrit, with a commentary and an introduction published from Penguin Black Classic series, besides having authored several papers in philosophy. He has also contributed to the EPG Pathshala, a Government of India initiative for which he created a first-year course on ethics entitled Ethics 1, a historical overview of moral theory from the Indian and European tradition. Today evening, Dr. Ranganathan will be delivering a talk on social privilege versus logic, interpretation versus explication. I invite the esteemed speaker to deliver the lecture. Over to you, Dr. Ranganathan. And for the perusal of the participants, I'll be pleased posting the link to Dr. Ranganathan's website where you can view a totality of his work. Over to you, Dr. Ranganathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for that lovely introduction. I feel very privileged to be here. I'm going to open up my, where did it go? Did I shut it off? There we go. I'm going to open up my presentation. And so here we are. So I think you've already seen the abstract, so I'm not going to read over the abstract, but the gist of the idea that I want to explore here is that there's a very basic choice that we're presented with between 2 incompatible methodologies when we are faced with the question of understanding. And only one of them is reasonable, and the other one is the paradigm of irrationality. However, that paradigm of irrationality is derivable from the most basic model of thought in the Western tradition, called the linguistic model of thought. So, so even though we can methodologically distinguish the bad or wrong methodology from the Western tradition, the fact that it constitutes a kind of kernel of this tradition means that when we are criticizing this methodology, we are also criticizing the imperialism of the Western tradition. And the methodology, as I mentioned, is the paradigm of irrationality, but what it does is it substitutes reasoning with social privilege, or at least the only way that you can make the bad methodology function in any social context is if the methodology basically inputs the assumptions that constitute a kind of social privilege. Because in that case, the failure of the methodology to be reasonable will be overridden by the kind of the social acceptance or approval of the results of the methodology. So it'll produce a kind of false positive of acceptance amongst people who are regarded as authorities. But it by simply looking at the details of the methodology, we see that it's just it's absurd. And so putting all this together, right? One of the things that we need to appreciate is that its widespread acceptance is not evidence of it being a good methodology, because rather its widespread acceptance is better understood as a function of social privilege. So to enter into this discussion, I'd like to start at what I think is kind of a very procedural basic, right? So one of the things that we teach beginning philosophy students and anybody who will listen are basic skills in logic. And so, right, there's so logic or reason is really about providing support for conclusion. So reason in the abstract is the relationship of support that one set of propositions provides for another. And there are three forms of reason that we teach: deduction, induction, abduction. Okay, so let's start with deduction, and then we'll look at induction, inference to the best explanation, or abduction. I won't talk in detail, but we can, the conclusions we derive from examining these forms of reasoning apply there too. So deduction is famously a mode of reasoning that's assessed by the standard of validity. The standard of validity is that if the premises of an argument are true, the conclusion has to be true. And there's an analog in induction. So induction has to do with the extrapolation of generalizations from a data set. And so we don't talk about validity when we're talking about induction. We talk about strength. We talk about a strong induction as an induction where the data actually supports the conclusion or the extrapolation. And then finally, abduction, we can note that when you are inference to the best explanation is this method where we have something that has to be explained, and then we have candidate theories, and then we try to choose the best out of the candidate theories, right? Once again, what's going on is we're choosing the best theory out of the candidates. So it's a matter of relative merit. Okay, so one of the things that I'll come back to this, you might notice, is that none of these forms of reasoning, when we're trying to understand what's at the core of reasoning, involves an appeal to what you believe is true. And this is very important, and I will come back to this. Okay, so here are some examples of validity. Well, actually, just one example of validity. So this first argument has two premises and a conclusion. The moon is a squash. Squashes grow on vines. Therefore, the moon grows on a vine. Okay, so everything I said here is false. However, the argument is valid, because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Now, let's think about an alternative argument, which is invalid. Joe Biden is president of the United States in 2021. Modi, sorry, it shouldn't be R, just Modi is prime minister of India in 2021. Therefore, Shyam Ranganathan is your presenter. Getting rid of that typo, what I've said here is all true, right? Modi is the prime minister of India. Biden just was sworn in as the president of the United States. My name really is Shyam Ranganathan. So I said a bunch of true things. However, the argument is invalid. That is, even if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't have to be true. Now, this, I think, is a really important point which doesn't get emphasized enough. You could have a perfectly reasonable argument where everything is said is false, and then you can have a perfectly unreasonable argument where everything is said is true. And if you were to study the criteria of all three forms of logic, deduction, induction, and deduction, you would notice that all forms of reasoning distinguish between truth and inferential merit. That is, inferential merit has to do with the support that one set of considerations provide for another set of considerations, and does not have to do with whether the considerations are true or not. So this applies. You have an analog distinctions in deduction, right? Between deduction and induction. So in deduction, we distinguish between invalidity, validity, and soundness. Similarly, we have weak, strong, and cogent arguments and induction. And then finally, an inference to the best explanation. When you're choosing the best explanation out of candidates, you're not necessarily choosing the true explanation. You're just choosing the one that's better than the alternatives, which is why, you know, people who don't understand reason often get upset when scientists change their mind. Scientists change their mind because in employing inference to the best explanation, they're always just choosing the best relative to what they have in front of them. They're not necessarily choosing what under kind of subspecies eternitatis is going to be the right theory. So let's kind of put this distinction between considerations based on truth and considerations based on reasoning. Let's put this in the background. And now I want to distinguish between two methodologies for reading and understanding philosophy. So this is what I call explication. So when we explicate, we deductively derive via validity from what A says, a theory A, a theory that further entails by validity controversial claims about T. The theory is A's theory of T. Do this recursively, and what competing theories of T disagree about is the concept T. So I think when I look back on my philosophy education, I feel like this is exactly what my undergraduate philosophy professors taught me, even though they never said it. That is, they presented several different philosophers and we read them all, and we read them all within the context of some type of wider disagreement. Right? So let's say the course was on metaphysics, we would read several different philosophers talking about metaphysics. The job of the student would be to derive from what they read a theory that then logically entails the controversial conclusions that the philosophers are each making. And then at the end of the course, after you kind of studied various contributions, you would understand the topic as what everybody was disagreeing about. Now, one very important feature of this is that you could do this while being agnostic. And in fact, in a way, it's a little easier to do it while being agnostic, because you're not at any point trying to understand what the philosophers are saying in terms of what you believe is true. You are just employing deductive logic to derive from what they say a theory that entails their controversial claims. And then after it's all over, you sit back and you reflect upon what the disagreement is. And this too is a matter of deduction. You just deduce from the conflicting theories a topic of disagreement. Okay, now if you were to do this to Indian philosophy, you would find that there's only one concept of dharma, and this concept is the right or the good. So what does this mean? What this means is that if you were to employ explication, you would go around looking at what every philosopher or philosophical school or contribution in the South Asian tradition has to say about dharma, and you would use deductive validity to derive from each perspective a theory that then entails what that perspective is saying about dharma, and then you would understand the topic of disagreement as what the conflicting theories are converging on as they disagree. And what I point out is that this actually leads to the identification of four basic ethical theories, right? Virtue ethics, the good produces the right. Consequentialism, the good end justifies the right. Deontology, the right justifies the good. And then finally, bhakti/yoga, the right produces the good. Okay, so I had kind of, this had all become clear enough to me just as I was starting to edit the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics. And so I used this methodology to provide feedback and organize as far as possible the contributions of the various authors. And what you'll find, right, when you look through these contributions and when you apply this methodology across the South Asian tradition is that they were ubiquitously disagreeing about moral philosophy. Why? Because the basic concept of moral philosophy, what moral philosophers disagree about, is the right or the good. And that's exactly what Indian South Asian philosophers were doing. They were disagreeing about the right or the good when they were talking about dharma. So this is very important. If you employ explication, you arrive at only one concept of dharma. There aren't a million concepts. There aren't multiple. There's just one concept of dharma, the right or the good. But there are multiple theories of dharma. That is, every darshana and every sub-darshana has its own theory of what dharma is. And this is not anything that's necessarily explicitly said, but you can explicate, that is, render it explicit, if you employ this very basic methodology of applying logic to the challenge of understanding the text. Now, one thing I didn't write here, which I think is really important, is that if you do apply explication, there's no way to simply understand a text or a tradition in isolation. That is, you have to have a macroscopic view of the philosophical possibilities and also a tradition to understand what the darshana or the perspective of the philosopher is saying, because the content of what they're saying only starts to become clear when we understand what the disagreement is about. Okay, and so we're not in a position to appreciate any philosophical position in any tradition until we understand how it contributes to philosophical disagreement. So in contrast to this kind of philological method where you just dive in some type of very deep microscopic way into a text or a particular passage, explication, and I think philosophy really leads us to have a broader and broader and bigger picture view of any issue. The issue is only definable and rendered transparent when we've raised the analysis to the level of a macroscopic disagreement. Okay, so if you are working on a South Asian tradition, right, whatever the tradition is, I think what this says is that you need to take a look at what were people disagreeing about in the tradition. Okay, so what Indologists do is they don't do this. So Indologies is largely Eurocentric activity. It's a study of India, right? And so what you find in Indology instead is the employment of what unsuccessful students of philosophy do. Okay, so an unsuccessful student in philosophy does not explicate. That is, they don't use logic to understand the implications, the theoretical implications of what a philosopher is saying. And then they don't further extrapolate and appreciate how that entails a contribution to a disagreement. They rather interpret. Okay, now when you interpret, you take your perspective as the benchmark. So then if I was to say interpret Plato or Aristotle, I would have to understand Plato or Aristotle in terms of what I believe. And then, of course, this only works or produces a satisfactory result in cases where there's an agreement between my worldview or my way of looking at things and the philosopher I'm reading about. Now, if you apply this to South Asia, what you would do is you would try to understand every single usage of a term like dharma in terms of your perspective. And then you would correlate claims that South Asian thinkers are making about dharma with what you would say in that context. Now, what this results in, first of all, this is nonsense, because it's a marked departure from logic, right? So when I'm trying to understand something by way of logic, I'm not trying to understand it in terms of what I take to be true. Why? Because logic is not about truth. It's about inferential support. So the moment I try to interpret, I am departing from very basic requirements. The moment I try to interpret, I'm departing from logic. And then I'm adopting a kind of methodological narcissism, where it's my perspective that what I'm reading has to be measured by. So one of the outcomes of this methodological narcissism is that Dharma ends up seeming to mean a million different things in the South Asian tradition, and every meaning of Dharma is just what the Indologists would have said in that context. So the Indologists is basically substituting themselves for the philosophy that's being talked about. So one further implication of this is that it results in the depiction of non-Western traditions as mystical and spiritual, right? Because there's no logic to the methodology. And so as the methodology is illogical, the results are going to seem illogical. And so that's why we get this mythology being developed that, you know, reason is this very Eurocentric thing, and what's going on outside of Europe is religion and spirituality. Now, for Indology, what this results in is the multiplication of concepts of Dharma. So on the standard Indological view, there's no one concept of Dharma. There are many concepts of Dharma, but, and this is, I think, really important, no Indian philosopher, South Asian philosopher is depicted as having a theory about Dharma, because there's nothing to have a theory about. It's just a word that ends up having all sorts of meanings, and each meaning is judged by the kind of the narcissism of the interpreter. So it results in a total fragmentation of South Asian moral philosophy. So whereas Explication shows you that actually, contrary to stereotypes that South Asian philosophers weren't interested in ethics, that was kind of the basic topic. Dharma was the basic topic of the South Asian tradition. Right, so anyways, I already said this common view of Indology. Terms like Dharma have many meanings. There's no ancient tradition of Indian ethics. It's all spirituality. So here's a quote from Binmal Motilal, who, at least when I started as a student, was often spoken about with great reverence and awe for being some type of genius. So here's what he says about South Asian philosophy. Professional philosophers of India over the last 2,000 years have been consistently concerned with the problems of logic and epistemology, metaphysics and soteriology, and sometimes they have made very important contributions to the global heritage of philosophy. But except some cursory comments and some insightful observations, the professional philosophers of India have very seldom discussed what we call moral philosophy today. Now, the reason why I have this part highlighted in red is that this is the little this is Motilal confessing that he's an interpreter. That is, he is expecting, well, in fact, it even comes, there are other parts in this passage where he says things like, oh, well, you find a little bit of this, what we call moral philosophy in the Dharma Shastras or in the epics, but largely they didn't do what we call moral philosophy. That's the interpreter accounting for South Asian. So if I was an explicator, I wouldn't expect South Asian philosophers to talk about what I call moral philosophy, because I would expect a disagreement. So I would expect that they had all sorts of things to say on the topic that I would never call moral philosophy. But for the interpreter, that ends up being the entry point. So my way into this actually was somewhat accidental. So after I was, I conducted research on this very strange view amongst Indologists that South Asian thinkers weren't interested in ethics. I wrote my PhD actually on translation as such, but more specifically translating moral philosophy. And I was interested in kind of very general account of how you would translate, given that linguistic differences are just a basic fact of life, right? Languages, they're syntactically different, they're semantically different, they're pragmatically different. How do I re-say what's said in another language when that language is so radically different? And further, I suggest, a methodological constraint. I said, well, let's try and solve this problem when we share nothing in the way of worldviews. That was very important my way of thinking about it. So this is a relatively recent Rowledge Handbook of Translation and Philosophy. I have an article in here called Context and Pragmatics that kind of sums up a lot of my work on this. But one of the things I discovered is that that even though continental and analytic philosophers disagree with each other, or at least they appear to disagree with each other, and there seems to be some type of great diversity of views in this tradition, it's actually a tradition based on a common commitment that goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. And that's the idea that thought is the same as linguistic meaning. And so for those who are interested in a philological approach or curious about a philological approach to the study of South Asia, that's just the deductive outcome of this very basic commitment of the Western tradition. The most basic commitment of the Western tradition is that thought is just the meaning of what you say. Okay, logos, one word for thought, opinion word. But notice, if thought is the meaning of what I say, then to account for a thought is to account for it in terms of what I would say. And then, right, once I have to explain things in terms of what I would say, I'm interpreting, because what I would say is what I take to be true. So this account of thought that's really at the basis of the Western tradition generates interpretation. It leads to the conflation of what is linguistically encoded in my cultural practice with the possibilities of what's thinkable. Okay, and so this is, so what I've done is I've created this kind of orthographic term, the West, with a capital W that leans on the East. It's to signify the colonial and imperial aspects of this intellectual tradition, and to distinguish the West, written this way, from just being geographically Western. So I'm geographically Western. I was born and raised in Canada, but I denounce the West. I denounce this intellectual tradition that prioritizes my cultural competence as though it's a criterion that the whole world has to somehow come to terms with. Okay, so I've already said this. If one adopts a linguistic account of thought, then one has to endorse interpretation. One should reject interpretation. This is the modus tollens, right? So if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So why should we reject interpretation? Because it breaks every rule of logic, right? But then if we reject the Q of the if P, then Q, then we have to reject the linguistic account of thought. So one of the things, before I get to the further implications, well, this is, I guess, a further implication, is that, the whole world believes that there's such a thing as religion. So one of the things I pointed out in my research is that religion is a concept. Well, I mean, this is not new to me. Historians have noted that the very idea of religion has to do with the West's intellectual tradition. That is, as it expands colonially in the world, it starts to understand alien traditions in terms of religion. But nobody really had a great explanation for why this came about. And I have an explanation. Well, if you have this linguistic model of thought, then you will treat your cultural outlook as though it's the same thing as what's reasonable. But at the same time, you're not going to be able to make sense of what alien traditions have to say, because you're going to be interpreting, and that only helps in cases when what you're interpreting agrees with you. And so religion ends up being the word that the Western tradition uses for every tradition that it cannot interpret according to its own tradition. And so we see this, of course, historically, right? So, and one of the things I point out in this book is that Hinduism is perhaps the most interesting of religions, because it ends up being a word that takes up the whole entirety of the disagreements of South Asian philosophy. So, with this kind of colonial innovation of the idea of religion, and then the employment of this concept by British administrators to define Hinduism, they basically take an entire disagreement of philosophical differences and then say, okay, that's your religion. But religion then is really just, the very idea of religion, I suggest, is kind of the precursor to race, right? So just as, Europeans have no color and everybody else is a person of color, the European tradition, no matter what a European intellectual says, is always treated as secular. So when Plato talks about God, the afterlife, rebirth, that's all secular. But if you find that something said like that by someone from outside of the tradition, it becomes religious. And conversely, right, you can find these, atheistic naturalisms like the Sankhyakarika, where the universe is thought to be an evolution of matter. And because it's said by a South Asian, it becomes religion, right? Whereas if it was said by a European, it would be secular philosophy. So one of the things that I noticed, and it took me a while to see this, is that I think this distinction between explication and interpretation is actually, in a way, at the start of the Yoga Sūtra. So these are kind of the very famous lines from book 1, 2 to 4. So explication, I think, is basically a kind of is the practice of yoga in the most basic sense of yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, right? So when you are practicing or engaging in yoga, you're not treating your mental content as though it's something you need to relate to by attitudes, whether these are fear, hope, etc. You treat your mental content as something that you have to use responsibly in a manner that protects your autonomy. And that's exactly what deductive validity and all those forms of logic do. They help you deal with mental content responsibly in a manner that respects your autonomy, right? So when I'm reasoning, I don't have to believe what I'm reasoning about. I simply use the propositions I'm considering to construct an argument, and then I consider it. And then the alternative, vritti sarupyam itara, that's, I think, interpretation where you identify or get swept up by the content that you are considering. Okay, so there you have it. So it wasn't like when I was thinking about explication, I was trying to make something up. In a way, I was trying to come to terms with what's really a very basic skill in the study of philosophy. But then I noticed there are these alternatives, and then as I started to consider it further, I noticed, hey, this sounds like what potentially he's talking about. As a complete side note, I translated my translation of the Yoga Sūtra I developed while I was working on my PhD in translation. And even at the time, as I was reading the Yoga Sūtra, it rung lots of bells with respect to a diagnosis of problems that people have in translation theory, right? Because if you try to understand a text interpretively, it's going to be harder when that text comes from an alien tradition. But if you can do something more yogic, then all of a sudden you have a methodology for dealing with content that doesn't have to do with how you see the world. And that can solve all these, I point out that way of looking at translation solves all these classical problems that arise if we're interpretive. Okay, so one of the things that I have noticed or encountered with interpretation is that people who interpret engage in a kind of descent into logical madness. And this descent into logical madness is not polite. It breaks every rule of logic. It breaks the most basic formal rule of logic, but then it leads to all sorts of informal fallacies. Now, in practice, when I have shared this view with others, with people who are interpreters, I found myself being kind of attacked via ad hominem arguments. And I didn't quite understand this until I started to kind of map out what happens, right? So let's say you decide to interpret. So in order to interpret, you have to violate validity, because validity won't allow you to explain things in terms of what you think is true. So now you violated that, and now you attempt to appeal to authority yourself, right? You see your worldview or what you are willing to agree with as though that's the authority that has to be satisfied. And that leads to begging all questions. That is, there's no independent reason for any conclusion that you wish to derive, because any possible reason you think is acceptable is something you are already committed to. Okay? And so interpreters tend to beg the question of methodology. They'll say that all explanations are ultimately some form of interpretation, right? And usually that's the point at which interpreters start to articulate their bias, right? Their methodological confusion. They tend not to appreciate the prior steps, that they're making a choice to engage in a form of reasoning that violates logic. And they tend not to appreciate that they are really just trying to appeal to themselves and their birds of a feather as the authority. But then they beg the question, that is to assume as a conclusion, as a reason what is to be proven. And then that leads to tukuku. Tukuku is the accusation of hypocrisy. So once they've begged all the questions and then assume that there is no methodology but interpretation, they accuse others, like me, I get accused of actually interpreting even though I disclaim that. And then this kind of, the final resting point is ad hominem, right? Then at some final point, there will be this accusation that I have failed to come to terms with my own methodology. But now, why is this ad hominem? Because an ad hominem argument criticizes not what a person is arguing, but them. but an ad hominem argument is not an ethical criticism. It's a way to discount what people are trying to argue, right? So if you can depict someone as not worth listening to because they're somehow defective, right? You then try to undercut everything they have to say. So this usually ends up in an ad hominem, at a kind of ad hominem resting point. So I call this a vicious descent into irrationality. Why does it persist? So this is what I often hear from interpreters. And the funny thing about interpreters is that they're remarkably uncreative and unoriginal, because they're simply echoing what they believe, and what they believe is what they're already committed to. And one of the features of this theory is that it seems what you are already agreeing to seems plausible because you believe it. And so if you can read some famous person saying something that you believe, then you think that there's some type of independent confirmation for your thesis, when in fact the criterion according to which you assess this is just what you believe anyway. So it's a kind of sham. But this is a quote I kind of hear repackaged, thrown at me. A person who believes he is free of, this is from Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Truth and Method. A person who believes he is free of prejudice, relying on the objectivity of his procedures and denying that he is himself conditioned by historical circumstance, experiences a power of prejudice that is unconsciously dominates him, visa tergo. Now in South Asia we would call this a kind of samskara, right? So according to this, if you deny that you have a prejudice, you are operating according to a kind of samskara that leads you to act in this kind of prejudicial manner. Okay. Now, the main problem, there are lots of problems with this defense, but notice this is a defense. It's actually a very bizarre defense. It's a kind of tukuku defense, this kind of claim that we're all guilty, you're guilty too. It doesn't deny that explanations in terms of prejudice are a bad thing. It criticizes someone who denies that they have prejudices, right? Now, the problem is that it kind of confuses what the options are, right? So as someone who advocates explication, I am not claiming that I have no prejudices. I'm suggesting that we have to choose between two methodologies. One methodology, interpretation, gives free rein to my prejudice as though it's input, as though it's an input to the methodology, right? So if I'm an interpreter, I give free rein to my prejudices, as though that's what has to do the work in explanation. If I'm an explicator, if I engage in yoga, right, in this very basic sense of chitta vritti nirodha, I don't deny having prejudices. I just don't treat those as though that's data in explanation. So sure, I have all sorts of prejudice. For instance, I've already come to the conclusion in a way, right, that explication is the correct methodology. Now, calling that a prejudice is let's, for the sake of argument, call it a prejudice. It's a conclusion of an argument or of an inquiry, which isn't the same thing. But even if I elevate that to a prejudice, it doesn't stop me from understanding someone who disagrees with me, right? So as an explicator, I am able to understand that there are people who denounce this methodology and prefer interpretation. If you interpret, you can't see that there's an alternative. It's just you only have one option, which is interpretation. So they have a kind of very skewed way of thinking about the issue. The further evil of the project is that it confuses confession with innocence, right? So Gadamer says that if you don't admit that you are prejudiced, you are going to be governed by your prejudices. But we could just think about, well, first of all, admitting that I'm prejudiced doesn't stop me from being prejudiced. I've just admitted it. But notice that it doesn't help at all, right? So let's consider being a liar. To admit that one is a liar, if I say I'm a liar, that doesn't make me any more truthful. In fact, I enter the liar paradox, right? So far from becoming more sincere or truthful in how I go about the world, admitting that I'm a liar is actually getting myself into a kind of weirder problem. Now, in South Asia, the ancient South Asian yogic philosophers knew better than this, right? They knew that this wasn't going to work. And so what they suggested instead is that, so for instance, there was more than one option, but Buddha say, yes, you should be aware of your samskara. So I think this is in a way part of vipassana and advanced meditational practices, but you also are supposed to be getting rid of your selfhood, right? So that too ends up being one samskara that you don't grasp at, that you don't reaffirm. So what that means is you're not in a position to say, I have these prejudices, because you deny, or you're not taking seriously that I sense that would tie you to a prejudice, right? In yoga, the insight is that we need to understand our role in creating a samskara, which deflates their epistemic import. So that's kind of what my argument is, a kind of yogic argument. We have to look at the choices that are involved in choosing our beliefs and what we are committed to. And we shouldn't treat those as though they're kind of basic facts, but rather a function of our own agency. Okay, so I already said this. Okay, now we can also think of historical examples, right? So Trump supporters just recently in the US, right, they're very upfront about their prejudice that the election was stolen and Donald Trump really won. That's their prejudice, right? Against all possible evidence. No evidence ever produced in something like 50 court cases. They couldn't produce any evidence because there was none. But it didn't stop these folks from having this prejudice. And it did, nevertheless, rule their behavior, right? It led to that insurrection on January 6th, where people who are convinced that the election was stolen stormed the Capitol, right? So being aware of your prejudice has no magic. In fact, it's just a way to endorse them, right? And I think that's why I think that there's something deeply evil about this view Gadamer's advocating, that somehow if I just confess my bigotry, if I just confess that I'm sexist or racist or what have you, I am thereby not governed or ruled by sexism or racism. It's simply not true. But I think it probably has something to do with the fact that we get into a kind of liar paradox when we do try to treat confession as as though it were an upaya, a way to overcome your sin. Now, why is it that this persists? So, hopefully by now, I would have made the case that interpretation is just this kind of deeply irrational exercise that produces kind of nonsense and then projects this nonsense onto people that disagree. That's kind of what, so it happened historically as the Western tradition interpreted the rest of the world. It could make sense of it, and then it projects this inability to understand on alien traditions as though that's their spirituality and mysticism. And as I kind of engage or do battle with people who are interpreting now, they'll try and project their inability to understand what I'm arguing onto me, and then suggest that somehow I'm not making sense, when demonstrably you can look at the methodology they're employing as a basic violation of logic. So one of the things that I was kind of very interested in was this relatively famous finding by these psychologists, Kruger and Justin Kruger and David Dunning, where they noticed that there is this phenomena when people reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices because of a lack of ability, but their incompetence robs them of the ability to realize it. So this is called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And it happens when people have they have a lack of ability that impacts their self-awareness and capacity to deal with the data. So one of the things that I say now, or I point out now, is that interpretation is the most basic form of the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, if you were to think that a good explanation has to conform with what you take to be true, you are depriving yourself of the capacity to reason. By virtue of that decision, you are deciding to endorse a methodology that undercuts your capacity to be reasonable. And then once you've undermined your capacity to be reasonable, you will derive erroneous conclusions and make bad choices, but you will thereby be unable to reflect upon that error because of your commitment to a bad methodology. Okay, so interpreters, especially influenced by Gadamer, urge everyone to be mindful of their tradition as influencing the judgment. Oh, and this is, I think, the most ironic part about interpreters. They have no historical appreciation of the origins of their own interpretation, their own commitment to interpretation, right? So if you read Gadamer and if you listen to people who are really big on interpretation and say everybody interprets, there's no way around it, we're all governed by our prejudices, this influences us no matter what, right? What they're saying is basically a contradiction, right? Interpreters claim at once that all explanation is prejudicial, and yet the theory of interpretation is a universal truth about explanation and not merely a culturally contingent prejudice. Now, what I've shown in these considerations is that interpretation is a culturally contingent prejudice. It's dependent upon the linguistic model of thought, which is not a universal model of thought. It's just a model of thought, right? So it's the model of thought in the European tradition. It's controversial in China. Confucius seems to endorse it. It's rejected by the Taoists. In India, no one bought it. No one bought the idea that thought is the meaning of what you say. And there are all sorts of signs that no one bought it, but it's simply not part of that tradition. So, but you need this linguistic model of thought in the background to motivate interpretation, because there's nothing, interpretation doesn't have anything good going for it, right? Even the people who argue for interpretation don't say it's a great theory. They just say that we have no choice. But it's really weird because basically they're involved in this kind of very deep contradiction. On the one hand, they want to say that everything is just a prejudice, and on the other hand, they want to claim that interpretation is, the theory of interpretation is some kind of exception that when I know as an interpreter that interpretation is some kind of philosophical fact of understanding, I am transcending the bounds of my culture and my understanding, right? And anyways, it's just more nonsense, a remarkable lack of insight, the Dunning-Kruger effect. I mean, you can think about similar, analogs, right? I could be a relativist who says that everything that is true is relatively true, right? And that famously leads to the same kind of problem, right? Because if I'm committed to that claim, then I'm committed to one claim that's an exception to relativism, namely that everything is relatively true. But now I have a contradiction, because the theory from which I derive this idea that everything is relatively true, I treat as a kind of exception to that derivation. So interpretation is in the same category. All right, I'm almost done. So one of the things that I often, I think about and I get asked is like, well, is explication really possible? Is it really possible for us to apply logic to understand the possibilities? Now, one of the things I think these considerations should show is that the implausibility of explication is purely a function of assuming interpretation. That is, if we assume a theory of understanding that violates best logical practices, it creates all sorts of problems for understanding alternative. And so explication seems implausible, but that's because we've decided to employ a methodology that just doesn't allow us to be reasonable, right? But if we allow ourselves to take stock of the options, as I've suggested, we will see one is superior to the other, right? But then we have to explicate, and I think this is kind of the virtue of explication. Explication allows us to appreciate that we have a choice, a methodological choice. If you're committed to interpretation, you don't allow yourself that option. There's only one option, which is interpretation. All right. We have a choice. Those who choose a rationality of interpretation choose a method that has pragmatic gains when the interpreter is a person of social privilege. So, right, because when you're interpreting, you're explaining things in terms of what you believe. You can only really get away with that if you have a place within a social hierarchy that allows you to get away with that, right? So you have to be you have to have a social position in life that allows you to be irrational and get away with it. And the only people who have that kind of luxury are people with some modicum of social privilege, because everybody else would have to use logic in order to solve their problems, right? So only people with social privilege can afford to be interpreters. Okay, kind of my final final points. So usually, interpreters have this, they try and imagine themselves as explicators, right? So they employ interpretation to say, well, okay, now I believe what explication is, and now I'm going to explain things in terms of explication. Then they'll say, oh, but look, you have to believe that, right? So they're starting with their methodology of interpretation, and then they're using it to try to understand what explication is about. And then they say, well, look, this just shows that interpretation is unavoidable. So, I mean, I think one way we might think about it is that there might be a very basic mistake or fallacy at play. And this is a fallacy of, treating a proposition as though true for the sake of argument. So that's one option, with believing a proposition is true for the sake of argument. These aren't the same thing, right? So if I can treat a proposition as though true for the sake of argument, I don't actually have to believe it. And if I don't have to believe it, I don't have to engage in interpretation. But if I conflate the distinction between assuming for the sake of argument and believing, then it seems like I'm always interpreting. But these are really very different, right? When I'm treating a proposition as though it's true for the sake of argument, I'm engaging in yoga. When I'm believing with it, I'm departing from it. All right. So the final thing I want to say is that, the all the philosophers who insist upon interpretation, right? Where do we find this? We find this not in South Asia. We don't find this. Confucians sometimes sound like this, but Taoists are very critical of it. It's mainly analytic and continental philosophers who insist upon interpretation. And so, really, this is a theory that's culturally contingent, and it's a function of the linguistic model of thought, which is kind of this very basic commitment of the Western tradition. And so I think we can't understand interpretation without understanding it as the mechanism of Eurocentrism, Western imperialism, but also white supremacy. That is, because this methodology comes from Europe and it tells you that you need to explain things in terms of what's true, as it spreads, it keeps with it a Eurocentric orientation. But Eurocentrism is just a polite way to say white supremacy, because white folks come from Europe, right? So it's really there. It's politically a disaster. But we can see that the more basic problem is just that it's totally irrational. So I am going to stop my presentation, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ranganathan, for that presentation of yours. Very engaging, very illuminating presentation of yours. I now begin with a few questions that we have gathered together, we have compiled together. So the first question is, interpretation as a mode of explanation based on perspective or cultural vantage, as you put it, does not involve truth. It is essentially a belief-based approach to a certain topic. Then how do we make sense? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that that's actually an accurate paraphrase of the question. But anyways, continue.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry, I have my position, but go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. How do we make sense of the scenarios where we take one interpretation to be more accurate than the others? That's the question. And on what criterion is that value comparison based? Also, when can we be said to have had misinterpreted a text?
So there's right. So interpretation is always methodologically nonsense. However, you can interpretation is always an appeal to what you take to be true, and sometimes it might coincidentally be true, but it's still methodologically nonsense. So when people talk about the right interpretation and the wrong interpretation, it's always nonsense. Some interpretations might coincide with truth, but that doesn't make it reasonable. So for instance, my example of the argument, Biden is president of the United States, Modi is prime minister of India, therefore my name is Shyam Ranganathan. Everything I said is true, but it's nonsense. So interpretation confuses the issue. It makes us, we begin with the assumption that what we want is truth, as though understanding what's true is just what understanding is about. But that's just mistaken. So when I hear about this, well, how can I assess between contrary interpretations? You can't. They're all wrong, methodologically wrong. Some might coincidentally be based on the truth, right? So I could provide you an interpretation. Biden is the president of the United States. Modi's prime minister of Canada, of India. Therefore, my name is Shyam Ranganathan. Right? Everything I said is true. Sheer nonsense. So I think that, but the hold that interpretation has on us is exactly what accounts for why it's wrong. It's based on this fixation we have on truth. So to bring this back to yoga, ahimsa comes before satya. So when you look at the list of the yamas, right, before you worry about truth, you have to disrupt the harm in a context in order to understand. If you go straight for truth, you undermine your capacity to understand. So there are no good interpretations. There are no right interpretations, though some might also be true.
I see. Thank you so much. The next is the bifurcation of explanation into two modes, which is interpretation and explication, can be regarded as approaches applied in different domains of sciences. One is natural sciences, where explication as the mode of reasoning is applicable. The other is the social sciences, where interpretation and not explication seems to work, seems to be popular at least. In your paper,
Yeah.
In your paper, you have specifically focused on philosophical systems of thought,
Right.
Indian and Western, making any remarks about the broader division of scientific disciplines, without making any remarks about the broader divisions of scientific disciplines. Do you think acknowledging such a division at the very beginning would be a reasonable thing to do, or the bifurcation can be applied to the macro scale and not just on Indian and Western systems of thought? That's the question.
Wonderful. So macro. So my simplest response is that this generalizes, but so in any context, understanding in terms of what you take to be true is not an appropriate starting point, because it undermines your capacity. I mean, to do social scientific research, you have to process data. How are you going to process data if you're not going to apply the strictures of logic and induction to the process, right? So even in that case, you have to adhere to these distinctions. One of the things that kind of the precursor that got me to thinking rather deeply about these issues was actually thinking about propositions. And when I was thinking about translation, and according to the linguistic approach to thought, a sentence just has one propositional content. But one of the things I started noticing is that if you switch to this more yogic way of thinking about reason as the responsible use of semantic devices, what you will understand is that there are different ways of using the same meanings for different disciplinary purposes. And so the various different disciplines, whether they be natural science or mathematics or philosophy or what have you, are actually in a way different yogas, different ways of using meaning for different methodological ends. So the differences we see then across disciplines doesn't have to do with what understanding consists in, but more with what kinds of propositions are we investigating, right? And then that will have a methodological constraint on the type of information you're going to gather and the type of conclusions you can draw. But still, insofar as we're talking about such a basic distinction in logic, it applies across the board.
Right. Thank you so much for the clarification provided therein. Next up, one of our participants talks about the determination of thought by space, especially in the case of colonial experience, as it has been experienced across the globe. So what are your reflections on this phenomena of determination of thought by space?
So that great. So those are historical examples of interpretation. So what happens in the colonial context? So kind of part of my wider research, one of the outcomes of this research is an appreciation of colonialism as simply the attempt to interpret aliens by way of your own cultural outlook. And because the alien doesn't share your outlook, you try to subsume them within your culture. And that's basically what colonialism is, right? So you go someplace and you treat those people as though they need to be subsumed under your tradition. Now, in that encounter, because there's a power imbalance, it's not uncommon for the colonized to unconsciously and uncritically buy the colonial frame, where they start to think that indeed they have to be understood in terms of what they believe is true, right? And so the colonized then end up replicating this method of colonization, and they start confabulating stories about their own tradition. So I started getting very interested in that in South Asia with the kind of the pre-colonial and post-colonial understanding, right? So whereas pre-colonially, right, South Asians, I think, were really okay with disagreeing with you. It was such a basic part of the tradition. If you wanted to become famous, you go out and argue with someone, right? You go out and you have a debate, and you do philosophy in public. And if you go back all the way to the very beginning, right, Socrates is put to death by the Athenian court for promoting false gods and corrupting the youth. That could never happen in ancient South Asia because everybody had their own idea of what it was to raise the youth and what gods to worship. And that was simply how South Asians conducted themselves. They conducted themselves as philosophers in public. Add to this the colonial experience where you have an alien power coming in saying, we must make sense of you in terms of what we take to be true. And within that colonial context, people start to think, oh, well, we must understand ourselves in terms of what we take to be true. But notice what's true is the colonial experience. That's a fact. And so instead of rejecting the colonial experience by activism, it gets absorbed. And then South Asians start interpreting their own traditions. So then there's this movement away from this remarkable intellectual diversity to this effort to account for what everybody believes if they're a Hindu, and what it is that we as a group, how we differ from other people. So in my book, Hinduism, a Contemporary Philosophical Investigation, I say, well, if we really want to understand pre-colonially what South Asia is, it's just the disagreements of philosophy. So Hinduism, if we want to reapply this term historically, it's just the disagreements of philosophy in South Asia. Post-colonially, once you have the imposition of this alien interpretive frame, you have the ingestion, this kind of absorption of interpretation. And then you have generations of people not criticizing the colonialism that was inflicted upon them, but treating that as a frame for self-understanding. And I find this kind of personally frustrating. One of the things I suggest is, if you really want to be critical of the West, start doing philosophy. Start being a philosopher, because the Western tradition as an interpretive tradition is anti-philosophical, because it's committed to this idea that we have to all agree in order to understand. So anyways, the determination of thought in space, I think, is really just this kind of colonial moment. Otherwise, we're just all disagreeing with each other. And that's as things should be, right? We should really be free to be reasonable people. And that means that we don't have to agree.
I see. Thank you so much, Dr. Ranganathan. One of our other participants has the following to say. As per the Jain theory of Syadvada, theory of interpretation can perhaps be done relatively from the standpoint of the viewer. So what would you like to say about in the theories of interpretation done from the Syadvada perspective?
So everybody who has a philosophical perspective has some account of the things that we can disagree about. But interpretation says that that's simply the only possibility in terms of explanation. So I think when I look at I think it's a great point, right? So the Jains have this view that, well, look, that we can take various different perspectives on the same thing. That was in a way a kind of theory of metaphysics. I don't know if that was the same as a methodology for understanding the possibilities. And I'll give you one reason why I think there's a difference. Because I think the ancient Jains could disagree with people who didn't share their view. And if they could disagree with people who didn't share their view, they weren't interpreting. Because interpretation makes disagreement absolutely unintelligible. I do think that there are, positions like Buddhism Well, I think yoga is transparently clear about these things. When I think about Buddhism, like for instance, the Four Noble Truths, I sometimes see that as a kind of interpretive argument, right? It says, well, there are these kind of basic facts, and you have to understand what these basic facts are. But at the same time, right, it wasn't as though Buddhists couldn't understand when people disagreed with them. When you look at interpretation from the Western tradition, it's just this narcissism of like, my view is the limit in the possibilities of understanding. So I don't see interpretation really playing any role in traditional South Asia. Now it's a different story, right? After post-colonially, I see it all over the place, but historically, I don't see it there.
I see. Thank you so much, Dr. Ranganathan. Another question that is there by one of our participants is, how would you apply the interpretation explication distinction to how Western philosophers have dealt with the Western philosophical tradition? Example, right, the ancient Greeks. Whom would you regard as paradigms of good explicatory work in the contemporary world, either with respect to the West or the East?
So no one. So the funny thing about the Western tradition is that, so I'll give you an example. So one of the things, if you study, so let me clarify. I don't think anybody in the Western tradition does explication properly. But I'll give you an example. So for instance, when you're learning Frege, one of the first things you will learn about Frege is that he's the father of analytic philosophy. And why is he the father of analytic philosophy? Because of the linguistic turn. And what is the linguistic turn? The linguistic turn is the claim that we have to look to, well, it comes out in different ways. The famous context principle, it's only within the context of a sentence that a word has any meaning. But there's also this emphasis on treating sentential meaning as propositional structure. And people think, oh, big revolution. Well, it turns out that's just as old as the Western tradition. It's just the ancient Greek view of logos. There's nothing new here. But you can open up textbook after textbook, people saying new idea, and it happened in the continental tradition too. There were these hermeneutic thinkers who were like, we must pay attention to language, and people are like, oh, very, very novel. There's nothing novel about it. It's as old as the Western tradition. So one of the things that happens that when you operate within this environment of irrationality that's buttressed by social privilege is that you have a lack of insight, right? You have a lack of insight because you're not employing logic to understand the data. So you understand everything from your narcissistic point of view. So if you feel like something is new, you then think, oh, this is an innovation. Meanwhile, if you employed explication and you were like, okay, let's just tease out what is the theory that leads to this conclusion, you could apply that across the board and you say, oh, the Greeks already believed that, right? Which is, why the history of Western philosophy really is just a series of footnotes to Plato. So the weird thing is that not only, I think because, and actually I think this is a yogic point of view, if you are not aware of how you interpret the world or that you are doing it, and if you haven't criticized it and engaged in a yogic practice, you reproduce your samskaras as though there's something new. So you have this experience of life as though you're meeting up with a new problem. Meanwhile, it's the same practice going unchecked, producing the same kinds of results over. And so that's what samsara is, right? So, but then if you could take stock of methodology, you can break that cycle. So because the Western tradition is this kind of tradition of both narcissism and social privilege, it creates social privilege by the imposition of its narcissism. People in that tradition lack historical insight. So for instance, I mean, even talking about imperialism with philosophers of Western tradition, it's like you draw a blank. What would they know about imperialism? Because they've only ever experienced not being colonized, right? That's in their narcissism says what I experience or how I see the world is just the starting point of my explanations, right? So yeah, I don't see anybody. So one of the things I'm always surprised at is I'm the first philosopher I know in print to spell out what explication is, as I set it out. The word explication was used by the name is, it's been used before, but anyways, the methodology that I explained, where you just use logical validity to understand the possibilities. I'm the first, and I'm always surprised because there are all these smart, famous Western philosophers who had the opportunity, but they always defended interpretation.
Thank you, Dr. Ranganathan. Another of our participants asks, do you imply hermeneutics when you say interpretation?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Your views sound similar to J. Krishnamurti, who was against interpretation of his teachings. So do you denounce the theory of interpretation or advise a framework to be developed based on Indian contexts?
Well, thinking about things in terms of framework is itself kind of interpretive. I'd rather think about things in terms of methodology. So I would prefer that we engage in a logical methodology of explication, but that doesn't. So you know, a framework constrains the data. As someone who employs a methodology, we take that with us wherever we go. And with any new data set we're presented with, we can apply our skill and reasoning to what we are considering. So, I mean, I think, so one of the things that I kind of was surprised at noticing in my work is that my interest in kind of these very pure analytic concerns, propositional structure, translation, and logic, and my interest in yoga are like this. There's no real, it's difficult for me to pry it apart, because when I understand that being a yogi is about being very committed to these very basic challenges of propositional analysis, right? I have to take responsibility for what it is to think. It's not just something that happens to me. And then I have to engage in a self-conscious practice of using thought in a manner that protects my freedom, not in a way that subverts it. That's just logic applied consistently across the board.
I see. Thank you. The next two questions are more sort of descriptive, wanting to know your opinion on these. So, while attempting to understand classical Indian theories of ethics, you understand the Purvamimamsa thinkers to be advancing a sort of deontological theory of ethics. Could you please illustrate upon this understanding of the Purvamimamsa thinkers?
Yeah, I actually have a paper in the Ethics 1, the EP Patshala, where I talk about Kumarila, and he's got this argument for deontology that basically begins with a criticism of ethical naturalism. So it's more interesting. It prefigures G.E. Moore. So if you're familiar with the open question argument and naturalistic fallacy, etc., that it's a great little passage where you know, he does two things. He first of all criticizes the absurdity of consequentialism by bringing up the example of a student who sleeps with his guru's wife. And if you're a consequentialist, you should be okay with that because it produces more happiness. But that's wrong. This is Kumarila. So and then he says that, look, there's a circularity in naturalistic definitions of ethical concepts, because if I have to define dharma by happiness, then I have no way to elucidate happiness except by dharma. So I've said nothing. Moore says that much later. And he says, well, because of that, to avoid this nonsense, we need to simply endorse a deontological approach. So he's got a meta-ethical argument going, and he's got this normative ethical argument going. So that paper it's not a very long paper. It's one of my better papers on the issue. So I would reference that. I wrote it like, I don't know, a long time ago. So I don't remember all the details, but it's in there.
Thank you. We will look that up. And lastly, is the question that at one point in the paper you say that the distinction between interpretation and explication can be traced back to Socrates.
Oh yeah. Okay. So Socrates, I think of as kind of, in a way, he wasn't perfect at it, but I think he was kind of pre-Western, because I think he was trying to explicate. right? So he would run into someone and they would use the word justice. So in a way, so sorry, I was asked the question of who do I think in the Western tradition does it. So Socrates isn't really in the tradition. He's at the kind of the very it's not tradition. I think about people who come later. Socrates was in a way the last possibility of philosophy that got trampled on by the Athenian court. But right, when we read the Socratic dialogues, not the Platonic dialogues, when we read the Socratic dialogues and Socrates runs into someone and he says, well, what do you mean by righteousness? Or what do you mean by knowledge? He tries to derive a theory from what people say that entails the controversial claims that they're making. So you can kind of see him trying to put that into work. The reason I think he isn't entirely successful is that he tries to do this in conversation. So this is a very Greek thing, because the distinction between thinking and speaking disappears when logos is your one account. But explication is really only something you can do macroscopically when you can think about the possibilities of disagreement. So to really do it well, you don't do it in conversation. You do it. It's an exercise in pratyahara. You're abstracting from your experiences. You're thinking about the possibilities of disagreement. But I do think, nevertheless, that Socrates really gives us a taste of what might that look like in practice. So yeah, I do. So if you want an example of someone trying to do that, Socrates would be a good example.
Great. Thank you so much for patiently addressing all of our questions. I now invite Professor Bendur to voice her opinion on Professor Ranganathan's paper.
Dr. Shyam, it was a wonderful. I keep telling that I'm an Oriental scholar in an Occidental world, and I've been fighting against some of what you said, and the problems are similar, right? So my question is sort of related to pedagogy, because I've been facing this question of how to tell my students when we teach Western philosophy and we're doing a neat historical interpretation. So the word there is there. Do you think that Indian philosophy, because of its emphasis on explication, from what you say, seems to not lend itself to the historical, clean and neat interpretation because of the discontinuity? It's an explicatory.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether we can extend that. And the second is, as you're talking, also I'm looking at the tradition of commentary, bhashya.
Yes.
And we always think of, when I look at the translations, even Ramakrishna Mission translations and stuff.
Yes.
Commentary is not interpretation, it's explication. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought out a difference, and I have a new word for using, because I keep saying I don't want to use the word I don't want to use the word interpretation. Because bhashya, tika, upatika, or they're not interpretations.
Right. Well, Mimamsa, right? So bhashya, commentary, Mimamsa, right? Yeah. So this is, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Were those the two questions, or do you have something?
Those are the 2 points. The point about history and the point about bhashya.
So I think the point about history is that interpretation constructs a story that then is reified by the story being the criterion of explanation. So there's a kind of circularity, a samsara of interpretation that creates this view that we have this historical dialectic in the Western tradition. I think when you give up interpretation, you move to explication, every theory is understood in the abstract. Every theory you understand as a contribution to philosophical disagreement, which is why when I was very clear about explication, I could start thinking about how South Asian contributions are actually they're not conversations within a tradition. They are contributions to philosophy. So yoga is a contribution to philosophy. It's not, sure, you can look at it as part of a tradition, but that's not why it's interesting or important. So I think that, the move to explication makes it clear that philosophy is this logical abstract endeavor. It's not a description of conversations between people. That's the starting point, if at all. The actual product of philosophy is this kind of rarefied, abstract engagement So I think that story of the Western tradition is part of its own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's less of any kind of real feature of philosophy, but maybe a feature of that tradition, because it really is a tradition with so little diversity. Once you start explicating, you see that there are very few options, and the range of possibilities are like basically Plato or the Aristotle tweak, and then that just ends up being the way it goes. Sorry, your second question about Mimamsa, right, in Bhashya. And so one of the things that I think is important about explication, if you're very clear about the methodology, is that we don't have to agree in order to converge on an explication. And in fact, if we're all explicating well, we'll be able to converge on a Mimamsa without having to agree. I think when you look at the tradition, some people were better at it than others. And so, for instance, I think Adi Shankara, though very famous, is just really bad because he's got this one commitment to this Advaita Vedanta, and everything, no matter what the text says, everything has to be read that way, right? You know, in the Gita, Krishna's talking about the importance of engaged action, and you know, you don't have a choice to sit it out. And Shankara's gloss is, Krishna Bhagavan teaches that knowledge is better than action, and you're not an agent. Very strange derivations that aren't based really on the argument. So, but I think what's important, and you bring this out, is that when people are engaging in this activity of Mimamsa, the ideal is not to explain things in terms of how you see things. That is, no one thinks that's a credible intellectual endeavor. Whether they're successful in actually transcending their own narcissism is a separate question. But nobody thinks, as they do in the Western tradition, that I have to start off with my own beliefs and then make sense of the Upanishads that way. Everybody thinks something like, they're the Upanishads, and I am now going to tell you what they say. Now that attitude is a kind of explicatory attitude, but that doesn't mean that everybody's that successful at it. But I think that that's better in a way, because at least we have an ideal, we have some standard that we're trying to meet, as opposed to just how we see the world, which is no standard at all. It's just the contingencies of our circumstance. So yeah, absolutely. I think that it's illuminating to think about Mimamsa as this kind of effort to engage in a non-interpretive activity.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was wonderful. I'll keep you updated on the work. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Ranganathan. I now hand over the stage to Dr. Bala to please deliver a vote of thanks.
I think there are two hands that I see. Kanchan Kugate and then Yashika.
Yes, sir. Can we ask a question? Just the one thing that you said, that is it possible to have a non-interpretive approach towards Mimamsa or any interpretation?
Well, there's all, so of course, because you can, so the interpretation or explication are just basic choices we have to make prior to any effort to understand what we're looking at. So we always have that choice. But the interesting thing of when we see that we have a choice is that then there are standards, and then once there are standards, we can see how some people succeed and others fail. The problem is when you interpret, there's no such thing as failure. It's just how you see the world. But yes, absolutely. Insofar as we have this very basic choice, do I treat a proposition as merely the object of my attitudes, or as something I have to use responsibly as a reasoner, right? And so I can treat propositions about Mimamsa in the same way, in one of two ways: as something I have an attitude towards, this would be the non-yogic way, or something I have to yogas chitta vritti nirodha, be responsible about. And it's remarkable, the switch to the explicatory then shows that it's not all subjective. It's not all just about how you see the world. And there are different grades of success in research that you can measure relative to these criteria.
Just one thing I wanted to ask, does this also apply to literary hermeneutics then?
So, I mean, so one of the things that I thought about was that, okay, so earlier I said that when you're trying to understand what a proposition is, if you move to this kind of exploratory frame, you open up the possibility of different ways of using chitta for different kinds of yogic ends. And maybe one of those is literary criticism, right? I'm not entirely sure. One of the things that I often wonder about literary criticism is whether it really is something other than just people in a westernized tradition interpreting literature. It's not that it couldn't be something else. I just don't know whether people engaging in it are doing anything else. But notice once again, as an explicator, I'm open to the possibility that when people are engaging in an intellectual activity, they are failing in some way, right? That's a possibility. So it might be the case that there's some people who are being reasonable in literary criticism, but that, a lot of people who are engaging in it are just trying to tell you what Shakespeare sounds like or is like on the basis of how they see the world.
Thank you so much for addressing the query. Yashika, would you like to please voice your question? All right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Do we have time for one more question, Dr. Ranganathan?
Sure.
All right. So there's just one which has appeared in the chat box, which I'm going to read it out for you. In the mainstream intellectual humanitarian discourse, we are often encouraged not to stereotype. While stereotypes are not always right, they do tell a part of the truth. So how far does the rejection of stereotypes or widely circulated statements divert us from seeing the truth, is the question.
Yeah. Well, stereotypes don't do anything. The question is, how do we relate to them, right? So this is the basic yogic point. And you can consider any proposition, whether it affects you and undermines your capacity to be free, or whether it's something that you can employ in your reasoning, has everything to do with your choice of methodology. So, stereotypes can be the objects of criticism, right? So the same stereotype that could have an adverse effect on some person and play a part in their prejudicial activity can play a part in philosophical criticism, where we allow ourselves to be free of the influence of those ideas. So I think that moving to this kind of this yogic way of thinking about things where you have a choice means you don't ever blame ideas or thoughts. You're rather responsible for them. So if an idea or thought plays some role in mistaken behavior, that's not the idea or thought's fault. That's because someone decided to believe it and then act on it, right? So, in philosophy, we talk about the same things that people out there just believe. But when we do it philosophically, we disarm. This is the ahimsa. We disarm the effect that these chittas have on us. And then we're able to engage in a kind of reasonable exploration of their interpretations. Their implications.
Thank you, Dr. Ranganathan, for addressing that final query. Thank you so much for patiently discussing the questions and answering to the questions with us. I now hand over to Dr. Bala.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very illuminating talk and the subsequent discussion, Professor Shyam. In fact, I would say it's a very strong but constructive criticism of the Eurocentric approach that you have pointed out. In fact, which you said is narcissistic and also social pluralism, right? the Eurocentric approach. Yeah, in fact, if you look at the history, like comparative philosophy began that way. Looking at the other and trying to interpret the other, that is where the philology has become very important, because they have to look for the word and its grammar, and then only they can construct the meaning. So meaning is only embedded within the word and the grammatical framework. So that's how the whole exercise of comparative philosophy began. And Orthodox Indology that you're pointing out obviously is rooted in that particular tradition. And yeah, when I talk to, in fact, I wanted to, I'm saying it to our friends, students who have joined us today. Friends, whenever you start your research work, this aspect of methodology is so important, especially the students who are doing Indian philosophy. You have to explicate the methodology that you would like to follow, or you are going to follow in the dissertation. In fact, these days, many students come forward and ask this question like, should I follow hermeneutic approach or philological approach? So now you can just stop yourself, read these approaches, but stop yourself and read or listen to what Shyam is also saying, that there is an alternative approach of explication, where you will not be just interpreting, but doing more justice to what you are reading, the text that you have. So this is a very interesting and important disjuncture that we have to take note of when we are looking at writing our dissertation, especially when you are dealing with Indian philosophical texts. So with that note, I thank Professor Shyam for joining us, and patiently, with a lot of patience, he answered all the questions. And
it was my pleasure. This is great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we really look forward to seeing you in Delhi in the department, in the physical presence, Professor Shyam. Thanks for this academic solidarity, sharing the ideas and sharing knowledge with all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Have a good day and good night.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.